with Corey Robin. Yeah, just so you know, we're going to be recording this. So if you have any personal information or anything you don't care to share, just know that. So we're going to get started with our discussion. Jeremy Cohen of North Brooklyn Political Education is going to be facilitating tonight. And what else can I say? Oh yeah, just some basic rules or guidelines off the top. We're all here to learn. You know, this is more or less a classroom, so I would advise that you just sort of treat it that way. Just everybody's making comments in good faith. If you have a question at any point, put stack in the chat and we'll record your name. And just more generally on the structure of tonight, the way we're going to do it is Jeremy and Corey are going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have some questions from the political education working groups. I forgot to mention, this is a co-production of Lower Manhattan, North Brooklyn, and Central Brooklyn political education collaborated in putting this together. So we'll do a couple questions from the working groups, and then we'll open it up to general Q&A. And we'll go for about an hour and a half. So have probably about 40 some odd minutes for audience questions. And would also ask that we try to keep chatter in the Zoom chat to a minimum. If you have a question and you want to sort of put it in there, feel free to do that, but side discussions in the chat can sometimes be distracting. I think that's more or less it. So from there, I'll pass it on to Jeremy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Jeremy, I am, as Drake said, North Brooklyn Political Education and the North Brooklyn rep to the steering committee. And we're so honored to have Corey Robin with us. I've never actually met Corey before today, so but I'm a big fan. So I think this has been sort of a long time coming. Carrington from our political education group in North Brooklyn mentioned that, you know, one of our very first kind of thoughts, plans in the early days of North Brooklyn DSA political education was, let's have an event with Corey Robin. So I'm glad we're achieving that. And Corey, you know, people may know him from his books, The Reactionary Mind, his recent book on Clarence Thomas, also from his works, his various timely writings in Jacobin and other places. And he's a professor at Brooklyn College, I believe, right? And the CUNY Grad Center? Yeah. So, you know, the reason we kind of planned this event, the three political education groups, was to try and gain some insight, some sense of kind of, you know, we've obviously just been through this wild 4 years of Trump and Trumpism, and it kind of, you know, ended, it seemed like it was ending maybe with a whimper, but it kind of ended with a bang with the January 6th riots, which was like the proximate reason. Obviously, you know, CPAC is going on right now, right? Or was it earlier this week? Anyways, you know, Trump is like continuing to play a part in national politics and assert to some degree his hegemony over the Republican Party. So there's a lot to talk about kind of where the right is. And so we figured maybe, Corey, we could start the conversation there. And yeah, where do you think the right is right now? What's its current state? And kind of how do you see kind of Trumpism and the Capitol riots from today's vantage point?
Yeah, so I'm going to just pick up with a word that you just used about Trump's hegemony over the Republican Party. And I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with the caveat that this is what I'm about to say is going to sound somewhat counterintuitive and contrary, I think, to the way a lot of people have thought about Trump and the right. in the last 4 years. And I say that because I know what I'm about to say is going to strike people that way. Because the thing that I've taken away from the last 4 years is how overwhelmingly constrained both Trump and the Republican Party have been. Notice I did not say restrained. They have not been restrained, but they have been constrained. And I just want to kind of remind people of some things to just set this a little bit in context. So in the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, remember, the Republicans had total control over the elected branches of the federal government, total control, the trifecta, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And what's so overwhelming about that fact is how little they were actually able to do with that total power. The one thing that they were successful in was the passage of the tax cuts, and we can talk more about that. But on a whole host of other issues, starting with the attempt to repeal Obamacare, which they failed to do, not because of the filibuster in the Senate, but because the Republican Party was not unified in the Senate. They were not able to do any kind of repeal or any kind of tacking against Social Security and Medicare, which Paul Ryan, remember him when he was still the Speaker of the House, vowed that they were going to do in the spring of 2018. I'm sorry, in the spring of 2018. They were not able to get an immigration bill through, despite having total control over the branches of government, the elected branches. They weren't able to fund the wall, Trump's wall. That's why he ended up diverting the money from the Pentagon spending bill. So on a whole host of, whether you think the Republicans Party agenda is anti-immigration, whether you think it's big business, whether you think it's about going after women's rights, they weren't able to do a lot of anti-abortion bills that they tried to get passed that they couldn't get through. On a whole host of measures, they just were not able to exercise their agenda. And again, I just want to repeat this. This is when they had total control over the elected branches of government. Then in the last 2 years, when the Democrats won back the House, they had obviously even less control. But I'm just going to give you one example to talk about this because it's so close to the events of January 6th, and yet has been completely overshadowed by, and for understandable reasons. But on January 1st, so that's 5 days before the Capitol Hill storming of the Capitol, the Congress overrode a veto that Trump had done of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. This is the annual military spending bill, okay? This is where the Pentagon gets all of its money. And Republicans and Democrats came together overwhelmingly to override a veto of Trump's. Now you might say, all right, so what? Big deal. Well, here's why this is a big deal. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, all in the course of their presidencies, at least once vetoed the Annual Defense Authorization Act. All of them did it. And in each instance, Congress was forced to back down and revise the bill in order to meet the president's demands. This was the first time in modern American history since we've had an NDAA that a president has vetoed it and had his veto overridden by Congress. This is unprecedented. The other thing about this, and I'm sorry this is going to sound a little bit in the weeds, but this is kind of important, I think, to the larger question of Trump's hegemony and the Republicans' hegemony. If you look at the provisions in the bill that led to the veto, these are provisions that Republicans and Democrats together put into the bill. It's even more astonishing. So one of the provisions in the bill was forcing the Pentagon to rename military bases that had been previously named for Confederate generals. Congress demanded that they be renamed, not after Confederate generals. Trump vetoed the bill over that. Congress overrode it. Another, you'll remember during the Portland protests in the early part of the summer, the Black Lives Matter protests, these federal agents went in and started cracking down on protesters, but had no insignia, no identification on them. It was very, I would say if there was one moment besides January 6th where this really looked like classic fascism, this was it. And how did Congress respond? in the Defense Authorization Act, they now have a provision requiring any federal military member of the armed services or any federal law enforcement officer who's involved in a civil disorder has to have an insignia identifying them. So another issue that I think a lot of local activists in DSA care a lot about, the militarization of the police. That is the federal government siphoning off weapons and hardware to local police departments that make them more like traditional military operations. There are now restrictions in this bill that prevent the Pentagon from doing that. And then lastly, that diversion of funding to the wall that I talked about earlier, there are now restrictions that prevent that. So this is all the restrictions on presidential power that were put into the bill that Trump, for understandable reasons, vetoed and then was overridden by Congress. And I bring these up, and we could talk about a whole host of other things, because I do think that both the right, the center, and the left have a kind of common sense of what the 4 years were about. That I think when you look at a lot of the day-to-day politics, past the tweets, past the kind of scary stuff, the fact of the matter is that Trump and the Republican Party both were overwhelmingly constrained in a lot of what they were doing. And why that is and what that means and how to think about that, we're gonna, I think we'll have a lot more time to get into. But I throw that out there because I think you have that one reality on the other hand, and then you have this other reality that Jeremy alludes to, rightly so, which is this sort of seeming fealty to Trump that you see all the time, where all of these Republican operatives abase themselves, doing his bidding and doing his will. But it's not on anything having to do with policy, even when policy is about immigration, race, policing, all of those things. They're constantly putting restrictions on him. And yet they do these sort of performances of loyalty. And I think it's these two sort of realities that we have to think about and put into play at the same time, and to put into the same picture, or else I think we come up with a kind of false sense of Trump and the Republicans' power that doesn't take enough sort of the dissonance into account. And I'll stop there. We could, obviously go on much longer about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the next place logically to go is why you think then, I mean, if the Republicans are indeed weak and there is a sense that there's a kind of like Trump represents a kind of, some sort of decay of a kind of conservative hegemony, why wasn't there the Capitol riots? Like, how do you understand them? Because wasn't there a kind of like quite aggressive, I mean, like the Confederate flag has never flown in the Capitol before, right? So that does seem to be some sort of like aggressive step, which was not possible and not even desirable, that like, a George W. Bush or whatever would not even have sort of encouraged. And so how do we understand that? And then the other question is, if the Republicans are weak, then why would that be so? Like, why was the regime as constrained as it was, given that we do know Trump was a popular figure and, as he likes to tout, got more votes in this last election than, anyone else. It's just Joe Biden happened to get more votes than he got too. Right. But
that little fact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are great questions, and I'll start in the order that you took them. And I think the Capitol riots have to be put in the context of a growing sort of blatantly anti-democratic effort on the part of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And again, we'll have more time to talk about this. Conservatism has always been an anti-democratic project from its very beginnings in its reaction to the French Revolution. So that's nothing new. However, in the 20th century, conservatives began to understand that in order to beat back the forces of democracy, and by that I mean first and foremost the working class, that was the big battle for at least the first half of the 20th century, and then in this country, the extension of those battles to a question of race and civil rights and the question of women's liberation. The Republicans and the right understood that in order to beat back these democratic movements, they had to play the game of democracy. And they slowly over time learned how to do that, how to craft majoritarian appeals, right, that would speak to a broad swath of the population and enable them to enact their provisions, which were very, again, anti-democratic, but always in the name of speaking of a larger democracy. And you saw this in returns in presidential elections. I mean, people forget this. Richard Nixon was reelected in a landslide election. I mean, it's just unthinkable today. It was over 60%, I think it was 63% of the vote. You could never have something like that today. And Ronald Reagan got 54% of the vote, 55% of the vote in his reelection. So they learned to play that game. And then they, over time, started realizing that they couldn't do that anymore. And this began increasingly in the 90s and the aughts. And so I see what happened on January 6th as really the culmination of this shift in the Republican Party to understanding that the rules of democracy just are really, they can't game them, and that they work against them. And so now what you see is the Republican Party overwhelmingly depending on things like the Senate, which is the most anti-democratic institution, or one of the most anti-democratic institutions, the courts, and the Electoral College. And that's been the consensus of the Republican Party for about the last 10 to 15 years. In fact, you saw this a few days before the Capitol Hill riot. A group of the most right-wing congressmen who said, we have to certify this election because if we don't, we're going to cast doubt on the Electoral College. And they said quite openly, we can't win elections without the Electoral College. We just can't. So this is all this kind of the culmination of this anti-democratic sort of politics on the part of the right, knowing that they can't play the game of democracy the way they once were able to. The second part of your question, why are they weaker? What is the cause of this? I think that the right is always at its potentially its greatest strength when it has a real left to oppose. The right was born as a reactionary politics. Conservatism is a modern politics. It did not exist before the 18th century. And it was born in reaction to democratic movements from below. And when those democratic movements from below are not just in their movement phase, but in their successful phase, that is when they capture state power and start divesting elites of their privileges, and that can be the French Revolution, it can be abolition, it can be the Civil Rights Act, it can be the New Deal. When these movements are successful, these left-wing movements are successful, the right starts getting its energy back. And what happened between 1960s and roughly 2000, 2004, is that the right was gaining power and was overwhelmingly successful in beating back what seemed to be a real left. So successful that at this point, they've kind of lost track of what their project has been. And I think part of the weakness, part of the incoherence we saw under the Trump regime was a symptom of a conservative movement that is no longer absolutely clear what the catechism is. If you had asked a conservative in the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s, what's the agenda? They would have been very, very clear about it. And at this point, it seems that the one thing that unites them is a kind of owning the libs, the sense that the media and the culture is biased against them. And while I think that kind of symbolic cultural politics is quite real, right, and should not be underestimated, we should remember that in the heyday of the right, when it was really battling for power in the workplace and power in the family and power over the questions of race, those were very intimate personal conflicts. And the fact that the right is now so overwhelmingly focused on things like the media, movies, Hollywood, MSNBC, Twitter wars, what do all of those things have in common, except for the fact, the only thing that those things have all in common is that they are all at a remove from people's day-to-day bodily personal existence. Whereas the battle over busing, was not far away. That was right there in your school with your child. And these fundamental questions about, who is going to be sitting next to your child in resources. And the right won a lot of those battles. And I think because of that, it has lost its kind of it's sort of fundamental rationale. And so I think that's paradoxically my argument about why the right has become, in a weird way, kind of weak, is that it won the big battles that it set out to fight. And now its battles are kind of far away and ethereal. And as much as they galvanize people, clearly we saw that on January the 6th. When they actually have power, they often don't seem to really know what to do with it.
Like they're victims of their own success.
Yeah.
And do you think that's true? I mean, I'm wondering, especially because we're talking to NYC DSA, and a lot of kind of the work we do and the thinking we do about politics happens on a state level. Obviously, New York's a blue state, so it's less relevant maybe, but I'm thinking of like Gordon Lafer's argument in the 1% solution that a lot of right-wing progress in the last like 10, 15 years has actually not been so much about progress at the federal level and more about kind of the extension of the Koch agenda in state houses. And, that happened after the economic crisis, busting unions and getting rid of minimum wage laws, pushing out minimum wage and getting rid of benefits, blah, blah, blah. And I think we can see, there's some attempt right now. There's a lot of voucher bills out there that are getting pushed through state legislatures, and Democrats did poorly in state races in the last round. So, I mean, do you think, the Kochs obviously hated Trump too, but there was some sense where, okay, the Republican Party can kind of continue its infiltration of like kind of where the action really happens, and Trump can give us like a good spectacle at the top or whatever.
Right.
You think that's like a kind of unstable formation?
I mean, it's definitely unstable. I mean, it's definitely real, first of all, at the state, what's going on at the state level. But I think we have to remember that that's a retreat for the right. I mean, the modern right is formed in this battle to gain hegemony over the federal government, and insistently and constantly trying to get power over that, precisely because they understood that, they came out of the experience of the New Deal. They understood the threat that the federal and the civil rights movement, they understood the threat that the federal government can pose, and felt like they needed to get control over that. And now at this point, what they have is control over the courts, which should not be underestimated. Like, I don't underestimate that at all. I've always thought that Mitch McConnell thought to himself, if I can come out of 4 years with control over the courts, we will have been successful. And he's been very maniacal about that. So that is absolutely clear. But I do think that kind of turn, I mean, it's just the same with the left. When the left starts focusing, whenever the left loses a big national battle, what does the left do? Let's focus on local politics. And I don't want to diminish that or whatever, but it is making the best of a not great situation oftentimes, and an understanding like we need to rebuild our forces, and so forth. But also, if you look at the state level, I mean, I'm just like, Georgia and Arizona, like these are really big deals, what are going on there. I often think of Margaret Thatcher was asked this famous question about what is your biggest achievement? And this was like in 2001, 2002, after she had long been out of power. And she said, without missing a beat, she said, Tony Blair. And what she meant by that was that, it was the ability to get your opposition to kind of think like you. And I do believe that in the end, when it turns, comes, when we sort of write the history books, what is Trump's big achievement going to have been? It's going to have been, Arizona and AOC. And these are not things that kind of went their way. So I do think what's happening at the states is really important and really interesting. But these states that were historically red states, I mean, Arizona, Barry Goldwater's birthplace, Nevada, which is where Paul Laxalt, the Laxalt family comes from. These people who were pioneers. These are all now blue or trending blue states, and so I think it's just a very kind of mixed battleground there.
I guess this is maybe a way also, you mentioned the origins of the right in the French Revolution, and maybe one way to talk a little bit more about your work in general and how it might give us insight into the present is like, and maybe you've touched on this a little bit already, but like, what does the left, what do liberals and sort of the left, you think, what do we tend to get wrong, or they or we get wrong about the right generally? And sort of how can we how do we avoid sort of making mistaken assessments of the right? I mean, I guess you mentioned some like habits of mind, which is looking at actual policy achievements versus like what's in the media in order to understand the power of the right. But I wonder if there are other things that you think the left habitually gets wrong, or the liberals.
Right. So, when I first started working on the right, which was under the Bush administration, and I got into this kind of by accident, and I realized I was just talking with a friend, like this was supposed to be one article I wrote, and it ended up having 20 years of writing about this misbegotten enterprise. But I felt the first thing that the left did not understand, left and liberals, is that the right has a history, and it goes long, way back before Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and Barry Goldwater, and it really does go back to the birth and French Revolution. And I think that's important, not just for scholarly academic reasons. It's because it just shows you that the right from the very beginning has been always a movement of reaction against insurgent and emancipatory movements from below. So the right has always been a counter movement against emancipatory and insurgent movements from below. Now, the left, gets into a lot of fights about, well, are we about class, or are we about capitalism, or are we about race, or are we about gender? And the truth is, from the point of view of the right has been the most intersectional movement from the very beginning, in the sense that they thought these things were all connected, right? They thought, you read Joseph de Maistre, who's one of the architects of the French, intellectual architects of the French counter-revolution, like what happens in the family is mirrored in what happens in the state, and vice versa. And, or John Adams, if women are in revolt against their husbands, it's because commoners are in revolt against the state, right? So there's a sense that the right has always had, that battles around gender and the family and public life and the state are intimately linked. And I call this this sort of imagination on the right, that the private life of power, that the right has always understood a link between, the personal is the political, and vice versa. And so the right has always been opposed to these movements of emancipation, whether it was the French Revolution, or, like I said, abolition, the workers' movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, gay liberation, and now, of course, trans politics as well, right? And it's always because these battles and these issues occupy a very intimate personal space in the imagination of the right, and not just in reality, right? If you're a boss in a factory, you do not want your workers talking back to you. And if you're a husband or a father, you do not want your wife or your children talking back to you. And you don't want to be sharing bathrooms if you're white with Black people, or if you're, cisgender with somebody who's trans, and on and on and on and on. This is why the battle over bathrooms today is in a way is prefaced or prophesized in Edmund Burke's writings about the French Revolution. He talks about what is the threat of the French Revolution. He ends up talking about the hairdressers are going to start demanding rights. Hairdressers. How does he get there? It's because, again, there's this linkage between the body and these intimate personal spaces and what's happening collectively and politically. So that's the first thing. Went on a little too long, but the second thing is that and I think the left does get this wrong a lot, when the right is defending a hierarchy, whether it's a hierarchy of class, of gender, of the state, of the church, of whatever it may be, of race. It never simply just defends the hierarchy on the sort of old-fashioned terms. It always, in the process of countering the movement that it's opposing, it comes up with new defenses of those hierarchies that are oftentimes defenses that are more populist and more dynamic, and make it seem like this defense of hierarchy, rather than being traditional and stuffy and boring and old-fashioned, is in fact modern and edgy and more in touch and in sync with what the masses want. And so, often, this is one of my frustrations with the conversation around Trump. People, talk about this dangerous right-wing populism that's so, he seems to be so in sync with the id of the American people. Well, there's nothing new about that. This is what the right has always done. And if you want to think comparatively, Richard Nixon surfed the id of the American people a lot more successfully than does Donald Trump. And I could give you all kinds of statistics about that, but just my personal favorite instance of this was during the 2020 campaign. This would have been sometime in June, when the battle of defund the police was going on. Trump was talking in Texas. He was at a rally in Texas. It was one of his first rallies, I think, that was, because of COVID, was happening. And it was Texas or Oklahoma, I can't remember. And he hit this line. He's like, just think if you're a woman, a housewife at home, and your husband's a salesman and he's off on his job, and some robbers come up to your house, and wouldn't you want to be able to call the police? And I thought to myself, my God, this man's mind is like, he's stuck with Willie Loman and Linda Loman from Death of a Salesman, from the 1940s, 1950s.
Well, there was that great moment too where he's like, or when he started tweeting about suburban housewives, like suburban housewives,
Yeah.
They're integrating your community. It's like, what?
Yeah, he had no idea of who the people were to whom he's talking about. And like, say what you will about Ronald Reagan and George and Richard Nixon, they just had a much more intuitive sense of who the audience was. And I'm not saying that Trump doesn't have an audience. He clearly does. He clearly does, but it's just not nearly as extensive as being able to tap into the sort of imagination the way these other figures were. So the right is a counter movement against emancipatory politics. It has always been populist. It has always been anti-institutional. It has always flirted on the edges and the boundaries of the law. And it has always indulged in, if not the reality, certainly the imagery and rhetoric of violence from its very beginnings. If we want to think again about the violence of the right today, however frightening it is, in some ways it's just no comparison to the level of political violence the right was engaging in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the battle was over civil rights and the Vietnam War. It was just, if you read Rick Perlstein's Nixonland book, it's just, one page after another of these extraordinarily violent acts, that you're not just horrifying in the kind of in the act themselves, but that really had political bite, that achieved something. Richard Nixon would say with one, out of one side of his mouth, law and order, but then on the other hand, he's kind of like, nudge, nudge, wink, wink to these violent forces. Whereas with Trump, what I'm always sort of, left puzzled by is, where does this violence go? Can it achieve the kind of political potency that violence once did on the right? I think it's an open question. I used to think it couldn't. I'm a little bit more uncertain about this after January 6th, obviously. So anyway, I think, those are the things about the right to keep in mind. It's an anti-emancipatory movement, but that it draws on these sort of populist currents, anti-institutional, anti-traditional currents in order to shore up these hierarchies. And so that makes the right ever shifting in its target and its rhetoric, but there's a lot of continuity despite those shifts over time.
And I think, I definitely think, I think you'll find a very sympathetic audience here to the way in which that obviously pushes against sort of liberal pieties, the sort of, Joe Biden, like, if only we had the good old Republican Party that I used to work with, like James Eastland and all those other segregationists, like then we have a real America again. But I wonder, so I guess maybe on the left of that kind of current in the Democratic, well, one question is why, or what do we do about the fact that those kind of arguments, or at least the argument that there is something particularly terrible about Trump, did help kneecap Bernie Sanders, like one of our, great hopes. So why was that able to happen? And then the second thing I was wondering is, what do you think about sort of more generally on the left of the Democratic Party, the kind of rising left? How do these understandings of the right kind of affect how we think about like how we confront or face or think
Right.
through what it means to operate with the right wing?
Right.
Are we there is active debate on the left, like, do you go out and confront fascists on the street, or are you trying to win over the 74 million Trump voters, or what some portion of them, which portion are deplorables, quote unquote, and which ones are not? Like, these kinds of questions about how, if we accept that the liberal kind of idea of like the good Republican Party is specious, what does that mean for our political tactics and strategy vis-a-vis the right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And this is where I feel a little bit, out of my league, to be honest with you, and trust the organizers and activists much more than I would trust myself, the people who are doing the work, because, I'm not a political strategist, and I'm not, that's not really my strength. But what I will say is, well, a couple of things. First, I do think that the whole idea, I think the left gets into a lot of battle, winning over the Trump voters and that kind of thing. And the truth of the matter is, most Trump voters are Trump voters because they're Republicans and they're older. And that's where the great, not the margin of their victory, but the kind of the great bulk of it is. And those are just not people that one could win over. Primarily because they're voting based on an identity which is not just white identity. It's a Republican Party identity, and that's pretty well said. I mean, I think the real there's two ways realignments or fundamental transformations in electoral politics can happen. One is you peel off a part of the other party's base. That happened with Ronald Reagan peeling off the so-called Reagan Democrats. But the other way is a kind of rising generational politics where you get new voters. And that partially is what happened in the New Deal in the 1930s. I mean, you had many first-time immigrant voters who were the children of immigrants, because remember, immigration had been cut off in 1924 from a good part of the world. And so these are the children of immigrants, and they took a different path. And this was a whole new group of new voters, and they kind of reinvented what the left was and what the Democratic Party was, and the kind of our whole notion of the white ethnic, right? Jewish, Italian, Eastern European, all that comes out of the New Deal experience of the kind of new generations of immigrant voters. And so I tend to think that's probably where some portion of the action is. And I think Matt Karp has written really compellingly on this topic of that the real problem is not race versus class. It's just the multiracial working class is just completely not voting. And we see this over and over and over and over again. And there's a fight right now between liberals in the Democratic Party who want to revamp the party as a kind of white suburban party, and appealed, and that's a lot of how they partially won the victory in 2020, versus the Bernie Sanders wing, which I think of as the Nevada project. That I always try to remind people to it seems like a lifetime ago, but remember, it's just about a year ago, in fact.
Yeah.
That how you felt on the night of Sanders' victory in Nevada. And it wasn't just because Sanders won and did so well. It was just like whom he won with and who made that victory possible. This kind of immigrant working class Nevada voters. And I still think that's the project. And I still think it's viable. And it just, these things take time and effort. And I mean, I don't need to tell a bunch of organizers in DSA that. So, that's sort of where I come down to it. It's basically, you guys, know pretty much everything And I don't have much to add to what you're already doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'll send it to the political ed people in a sec. I guess just maybe to end on a more kind of general note, like where do you think the right is heading right now? I mean, obviously, prediction. What is that old joke that Marxists have predicted 10 out of every 2 economic crises. So predictions are not the maybe the best man's game, but
Right.
I do think where do we see the right heading? Is it right that like the Capitol riots will cause, you think, problems for them electorally, nationally? Has part of the elite, the donor class, even further pulling away from the right? And more generally, how can the left take advantage of kind of these dynamics on the right?
I mean, there's no question that that these moments that are very frightening for good reasons and horrifying to people who are on the left or liberals have often hurt the right long term. So Charlottesville is a good example of, Trump had a couple of very, very low polling moments in his presidency. I mean, they were always low, but these were extremely low. One of them was when they tried to repeal Obamacare. Another was the Charlottesville confrontation, where he did his, good people on both sides kind of a thing. It was an extraordinarily bad month for him. Another was the June 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. And then finally, the January 6th was lowest, polling record. So it is hard to make predictions, but my overall sense of the right is as follows, which is that it is a movement that is getting more extreme within its ranks, but able to make fewer and fewer appeals beyond its ranks, notwithstanding the inroads they made with Latino voters in 2020, which in the vast scheme of things were actually quite, not that large.
Humble.
And Trump, again, this gets forgotten, but the fact of the matter is he lost re-election. This is the first incumbent since Herbert Hoover, who came in controlling the White House, the House, and the Senate, and then lost all 3 by the end of the first term. That is a big deal. And I know I don't have to remind people in DSA about the importance of electoral politics, but these things are real. And so my best, for a while there, I was hopeful that we were headed to some kind of fundamental realignment in American politics, during the Sanders campaign, and had made comparisons between Trump and Jimmy Carter as kind of the last president of, Jimmy Carter was the last president of the New Deal regime. And Donald Trump would be, in my mind, would be kind of the last president of the Reagan regime. Well, obviously, that hasn't really come about. And so my best guess of where we are is this kind of extended ping pong between 2 parties competing over, at the margins, both of them extraordinarily constrained when they're in power and not able to get their program. I mean, the last president who was able to get a lot of his program through was the first 2 years of Barack Obama. And whatever you think of him, I mean, the truth is that in comparison to what came afterwards, and what I suspect we'll see in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, we're going to be in this 12-year interregnum where you see a lot of executive orders and not really much action beyond that. And so then the question is, what's happening on the ground? And there, I just think that as screwed up as the left is, and as as frustrating as I know that it can be when you're doing the work in those trenches, I think the left has now a much more long-term imagination and sense of on its way forward than the right does. And I think that matters in politics in a way that is very hard to calculate. But that ability to go into a battle and to think that you're going to keep going the day afterward, and that you're in it for the long haul to organize a majority coalition, I think that is what really matters. And even though the right has a lot of institutional mechanisms at its disposal, I think those are of limited long-term use. And so we're just in a kind of trench warfare while I think the left keeps going forward with the kinds of victories that we have seen in some congressional districts and in places like New York City on city councils and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think definitely that seems right to me. I think a concern maybe many of us had about Bernie's loss and Biden winning was, would this take the steam out of the left? But I think it's like an under discussed phenomenon that, especially like since Occupy, like that the kind of will to organize, the ability to like learn from mistakes and get better over time. This is like much more generally a value on the left now, and that is like quite. I mean, yeah, we're talking about however many members we have now, 70,000 person socialist organization. So that is I think very optimistic for what you're talking about, like this long arc.
Yeah, and if I could say something about that, you brought up the issue of failure, and the truth is every movement, whether the right or the left, experiences failure and defeat. And the real question is not whether you experience that; it's what you do with it. And from what I'm not really active in a lot of this stuff, but from what I see of the conversations, it just seems to me that there is, I liked your phrase, the will to organize. There is a sense that when these things happen and that, that they're inevitable along the way, the question is, what do you learn from it? What do you do the next day? Interestingly, if you look at how the right built itself, go back to the 60s, that's exactly, that was exactly, they thought they were on the long march. Something that they had in fact learned from the left itself. Many, organizers on the right came out of the left. So, that is what gives me a sense sort of long term. And the right knows this. I mean, this is why they're engaging, what is it now, 270 bills for voter suppression. They know very, very well what they're up against. And so this is a battle, that to my mind, and this will be the last thing I say, everybody is really interested in historical comparisons right now. Is it Weimar Germany? Is it like post-Reconstruction, the South, whatever it is. And to me, what this always reminds me of, especially this electoral rules and gerrymandering and all the rest of it, is that if you look at it's going to sound a little far afield, but I think it holds. If you look at Great Britain before the Reform Act of 1832, you had a ruling class that was increasingly out of touch with the kind of democratizing currents and changing demographics of the country. And what did they do? They relied on all this electoral finagling and trying to create districts, rural districts primarily, right?
Rotten boroughs.
Yeah, exactly. Rotten boroughs, where the sort of the gerrymandering was, so overwhelming, and where the lawyers' fees, by the way, to fight the legal battles over this, you had a whole generation of lawyers in Britain who were kept in permanent employment by this. It sounds to me very familiar, and it's a very old battle in democracy. It's about, over the franchise and the vote. And that's where I think, we are right now.
I like that parallel too. I've thought about this too, for people familiar with the Chartist movement. One of the kind of odd things that political organizers in the present need to think about is that we have a kind of very active, vibrant, new electoral surge, kind of without what we might hope is like a labor component of it and a kind of upsurge. I mean, there have been some upsurges, but obviously still the labor movement is at a relative nadir. But that is sort of in England in that time, kind of the edge of working class politics was actually not workplace organizing. It was organizing for democracy, political organizing, and that inspired Marx and Engels. And
absolutely. I mean, that's where Marxism, comes out of, is that kind of, labor republicanism. And, they did not poo-poo the battles over the vote and the battles for bourgeois democracy. And, there was a reason for that. And that's because the forces of the old order relied upon these, elaborate state restrictions on democracy. And that's kind of where we are, I think, today.
Great. Well, the stack is lining up. I'm giving pride of place to a couple of our political education people, and then we'll just start going. We'll take a couple questions from political education, send it back to you, Corey, and then maybe we'll take like 3 questions at a time. So we make sure to get to as many as we can. So I'll hand it to Carrington first.
Hi, and thank you so much for your comments. So Biden's early action suggests he may not quite deliver on many fronts, particularly in relation to economic equity. What impact do you foresee continued gross income inequality having on the reactionary right?
And then Drake, go ahead.
Yeah, Jeremy kind of asked a question about the future of the right and of the Trump movement, but I guess I wanted to ask kind of even more pointedly. Trump has, well, even backing up in your piece on impeachment, you talked about the possibility of realignment and what sort of things the Democrats could be doing to affect a realignment. And related to that, Trump has sort of threatened to form a new party, or people around Trump have threatened to form a new party. So do you think that Trump or the Trump movement could very well split in some ways the Republican Party or the Republican Party's voter base?
If you want to take those 2, Corey, first, and then we have a nice full stack.
Okay. In terms of Biden not acting on economic inequality, I think the most you could say about it is it just doesn't change the status quo really of American politics. I mean, as I said, we've been battling between a kind of vaguely neoliberal Democratic Party that's more multicultural and a neoliberal Republican Party, and the fact that Biden is not, whether through lack of will or lack of interest or lack of numbers, whatever it may be, I think that just signals is a kind of a continuation. And the tragedy to me of this is that it just I do not believe that economic inequality leads to the kind of culture war stuff. I don't buy that kind of analysis. But what I do think is that it allows, if you're not framing a fundamental battle that occupies the airwaves with, the question, let's say, of the minimum wage, it just allows this other stuff, to just continue, and these battles over Twitter wars and all that kind of thing. And so I just think it means a continuation of the status quo. The Trump thing of the new party, I mean, in the end, I don't think that Trump is going to break and that those forces are going to break, because I think they probably have a sense that they have more, ability, to stay within the party than not. But it is the most interesting, it's one of the most interesting things because, as all of you guys know, the lock that the 2 parties have over the American political system is pretty intense. But it's not, written in as a law of nature. And so were that to happen, it would be just a kind of very interesting development that would, certainly shake things up. But I in the end, I don't think it will, because I don't think they, I think they're, a little bit too insulated right now from political reality for that to happen. But I don't know. I'm always so bad at these kinds of predictions that I would hate to bet any money on this or anything like that.
Great. Well, we're going to start going around with the stack. Please, I encourage everyone, try to keep your questions a minute or under, because there are a lot of questions. And I might cut you off if you go long. So I have, for the first round, David Diaz, Philip Hansen, and Lee O'Brien. Oh, and last thing I'll say, Paul Horowitz put in the chat, which is correct. DSA has more than 90,000 members. As usual, I was being a gloomy leftist and, underestimating our strength. So David Diaz, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. My question is whether you draw a distinction between the different factions of the right, say, for example, the Lincoln Project versus, the anti-Trump Republicans versus the Trumpist Republicans, so to speak. And the other question is, the same goes with the left. I'm wondering if by the left, is this synonymous with the liberals, with the Democratic Party? Because, would Biden in this case be the left, or Nancy Pelosi as opposed to AOC?
And should I respond, or do you want?
Let's do three at a time, maybe.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Philip Hansen.
Hi, Corey. It's great to meet you face to face at last, if only virtually. By the way, a comment to start. You all seem to have forgotten how truly rotten Ronald Reagan was. I mean, his relation to the truth was every bit as, shall we say, flexible as is Trump's. I was reminded of that by Rick Perlstein's new book, Reaganland. But the question, Corey, I have for you is, you've mentioned, or you've stressed, how much in the face of traditional liberal criticisms that Trump is violating our, sacred constitutional norms, that far from that, it's quite the opposite. He is the beneficiary of the functioning of these norms. I wonder if you could say something about that and elaborate on that a little bit.
And finally, Lee O'Brien.
Sorry. Hi, Corey. You stressed how the conservative movement has almost historically focused on social and personal issues. And you listed quite a few examples. But one that you didn't mention, and I'm really curious about it, is abortion. Because I really think of it as one of these headline issues for certainly the evangelical right, but the evangelical right was until recently the basis of the right wing in America in many ways. So I'm just wondering, has there been a shift? Are evangelicals less important than they were? Or is it something that you simply just left off the list?
Right. So I'll kind of go in reverse order. So I did actually mention abortion in one context, which was that the Republicans tried twice when they had total control in the first half of the Trump term to put restrictions on abortion at the federal level. And both times they failed, which I thought was significant. They were not able to get a majority through, and it wasn't the filibuster that stopped it. But I do think, and I've written about this, that, abortion, it goes to the heart of women's autonomy and with women's sexual agency. And so it has not been a sideline issue for Republicans and the right, but it's been quite central. And I don't think it's been, shoved off. You have to look at the Supreme Court appointments to see how central this issue has been for Republicans. And this is something that, goes from, the most extreme person on the court, who I think is probably still Clarence Thomas, all the way to, who's now the liberal on the right of the court, which is John Roberts. But they're all united, if not necessarily on a project of overturning Roe v. Wade, putting so many restrictions on it that it's effectively, dead. So I think abortion is quite central to the modern right. In terms of the question about the beneficiary of norms, so I'm glad you raised that. So, this was something that, we don't hear this language that much anymore, but in the first couple of years of the Trump regime, we heard a lot about norm erosion, that Trumpism was a project of eroding norms, and in particular around the Constitution, and that Trumpism is an anti-constitutional project. And while I understand where that argument comes from, I really do believe that it gets something fundamentally wrong about the right. And I mentioned it briefly, but I'll just kind of elaborate it, that far from the right today relying upon, those mass movements and those mass rallies and this kind of mass violence, the secret source of it's not even secret, the real power of the right depends upon three constitutional institutions: the Senate, the Electoral College, and the courts, right? Those are if those were not in place, the right would not have nearly the kind of power that it has. And it's really important to be clear about this, because it means that the right is, in some ways very different from, there's been a big debate about fascism that has gone on. And one of the things that fascism historically was very much an anti-constitutional politics. Fascists really, was at the center of the fascist vision, not to be limited by a kind of written document or a set of norms like that. And Trumpism would be nowhere without that constitutional document. So I think it's really important for people on the left to be clear about this, and not engage in some of the kind of, I don't know, sanctification of constitutional language that I think could be real crippling for the left. The last question was about distinctions on the right and the left. And, you know, part of my work has always been about trying to get people to see the commonality and the continuity on the right. You know, there's been, you know, during the heyday of Reaganism, there was a big discussion about the economic conservatives versus the cultural conservatives versus the Cold Warrior conservatives. And what I've always been interested in, how does not so much the distinctions between those groups, but how is it that they come together? It's not to deny that there are distinctions, it's just, you know, what brings them together. And I think that makes the question about today's, you know, right more interesting, because the truth is, throughout much of the right's ascendancy from the 60s up through the Bush era, they were able to bridge over those differences. And I think what you're seeing now is an increasing inability to bridge over those differences. And so it makes these sort of factions that much more powerful. And you asked also about the left. I do think that there's a difference between liberals and the left, and I sometimes will talk about those differences, but I can't always talk about the differences, because from the perspective of the right, there is no difference. Liberalism always carries with it the virus of socialism. This goes back again to, you know, the very early foundations of the right. One of the things that Edmund Burke talks about is, you know, if the French Revolution takes its course, you know, you're going to see the kind of the apprentice go after the master. And you know, he even envisions, excuse me. He says this in 1790. He envisions what ultimately is going to be the Haitian Revolution more than a decade later. So, you know, this is 1790. You know, you haven't seen the terror. You've hardly seen anything. You haven't even seen the getting rid of the monarchy. But he sees that this language of bourgeois liberalism is a kind of language that will lead to what will ultimately in the 19th century be the much more cataclysmic battles of the social revolution. So I sometimes link those things together only because for the right's purposes, they are linked.
So I'm going to read a question from David H. Just one quick editorial point on the norm erosion stuff. I think, you know, where we see that maybe currently having its most consequential effect is stuff around the filibuster and this absurd idea that like what the Senate parliamentarian says is somehow like, you know, absolutely effective and it could in no way be
Right.
just they could say like, we don't give a shit, like we're gonna have minimum wage. And I do think like a big fight the left has over the next few years, in part to keep further radicalization to the right from happening, is to like, you know, get rid of filibuster, make the Senate a like marginally democratic institution.
If I could just piggyback on that for just one quick second, and you know, as outrageous as it is that we may once again be stymied by the filibuster, the fact that it's even a question today, I mean, let's not forget during the Obama years, it was not even a question. It was just like, again, it was like, well, of course you need 60 votes in Congress. It's just that's written in the Constitution. That's written in, you know, the laws of nature. So I do think we've come a ways, but clearly not nearly far enough. So sorry, just a quick piggyback.
So this is a question that was in the chat, and then I'm going to go to Fanon and Paul. The question in the chat was from David H. What can we make of the Republicans and Trump's embrace, even if only nominally, of welfare state policies normally associated with the left? Examples include increased food stamp benefits, unemployment benefit increase, stimulus checks. So kind of the COVID packages under Trump. And I'll hand it to Fanon.
Hey, thank you so much for your comments, Corey. This has been just a fantastic and such an interesting discussion. I have two questions for you. The first is, you talked about constraints at the beginning, but it sounded like the main constraint you talked about was just the lack of an ambitious program, or what you later referred as kind of a long-term vision. But are there other constraints? Are they structural, as in having to do with like what capital or like the sort of financial backers of the party, want? Are they more political or ideological? And I think very importantly, to what extent do these kinds of constraints apply to the courts, given the rights preeminence within them now? Second question is, I was just curious, sort of right in the line of what you and Jeremy were just talking about, what is the establishment? What does Biden see in this? In some ways I was kind of like, maybe this helps me understand, because I wake up and I think every day about, like, just panicked because it doesn't make sense to me why they're not breaking the filibuster, especially why they're not passing the For the People Act. If the Democrats don't pass HR1, the way I hear it and understand it, listening to Ryan Grimm, I'm like, this is the end
Right.
of our chance at having government. So, what's happening there?
And Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opening comments and also for the responses to the previous questions. So a few things I'd just like to get your thoughts about. One is we now know more about who's been arrested for the attack on the Capitol and their sort of class character to some extent, and wondering your thoughts about what has been revealed with that data. And the second is about the whole, this thesis on fascism in the contemporary period. And the better articulations of it, more subtle ones, are not that it's been fascism is hegemonic, but that it's inchoate or incipient, right? Which goes beyond norms erosion to focus on the penetration of the police and the military and the political cover for the use of violence that, mainstream, like, the bulk of the GOP has, given to those kinds of uses of violence. And the third, related to that, and to Fanon's last question, is about, the Chamber of Commerce and, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies breaking with Trump and his allies in the period after the AP certified the election, and what that signifies. So the three questions are all about sort of the class character of, Trump, his base, where capital goes, and this question about violence and penetration of the police and military.
All right, this is a lot. The nice thing about when I get groups of questions, I can pretty much answer the ones that I feel like I can answer and just not answer the others. The Trump embrace of the welfare state politics, I think, is kind of interesting. The UI benefits and all the rest of it. I mean, we have to remember again, Paul Ryan, who ran, the congressional wing of the Republican Party until 2018. Really, that was his dream, right? This is what he said he had been dreaming about since, over keggers, in college, and it got nowhere. And then you saw this kind of, stimulus package that was, especially on unemployment benefits, that was, really quite generous. Although, then the Republicans kind of backed off. But I do think it's kind of significant, and I think it matters a great deal. I mean, in a certain way, in a weird way, like the official political actions are running way ahead of kind of left-wing discourse, in a way that is often sort of surprising there. So I think it matters. And I think it sort of does suggest a kind of weakening of a certain kind of constraint on the Republicans. In terms of the constraint question and other constraints in the courts, the courts thing I think is super interesting that you raised, because from the beginning, to me, this was the greatest impact that Trump was going to have was on the courts. And I was writing about this in the spring of 2017, feeling like, the executive orders and all of these things, like, I know it gets a ton of attention, but watch the courts, because this is where Mitch McConnell is moving at a very furious pace. And, it's, if you're my age, you were brought up to think that the courts are kind of this great friend of liberalism and progressivism and whatever. And it's just very clear that that's just not the case, that the courts are now becoming what historically they've always been in the United States, which is a very reactionary institution. But one thing that did surprise me, I have to say, and that I did not anticipate, was how many, not only Republican appointed judges, but Trump appointed judges ruled against Trump in the run-up to both the run-up to the election and post-election. This was just shocking to me, honestly, because I really had felt like, these people are real apparatchiks. And, legal reasoning in courts are a weird kind of institution. They're obviously political actors, but they're not just agents of will. And I had thought that the whole point of the Trump appointees was that these were going to be just hacks who would just do whatever he wants. And the truth of the matter is that they didn't. And I actually don't know what to make of it. And I don't feel like anybody has come up with a good analysis of this, but it was really quite shocking. And not just, it was in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and North Carolina, where this really, really mattered. So I think it's a really interesting question to which I don't have the answer. Then there's sort of the last set of questions about the establishment and so forth. I thought there was a great report coming out of the University of Chicago on the class composition of the rioters. And the thing that was most interesting about them is that a lot of them were, doctors, lawyers, people college educated, professionals. And I don't know, I haven't been involved enough in the last couple of years in the left-wing arguments about Trumpism. Is it, the white working class? Is it a working class? And all the rest of it. But it seems pretty clear is that these are, a lot of people are kind of professional people, many of them heavily in debt, which, to my mind, just makes them seem very representative of the United States, just over leveraged, in debt, with great ambitions for something more, and yet sort of unable to act upon it. And so I think there's a lot of interesting material there, which makes me sort of leery of the kind of establishment distinction that people often kind of draw upon, because a lot of these figures were very kind of establishment figures. They're not Fortune 500 CEOs, true, but that's not the whole of the establishment. So I'm not quite sure what to make of it. But I also think it shows that, those are not the people, those are not the constituencies for the left. This battle that the left keeps getting into, that somehow or another, in order to advance social democracy, we've got to win over these kind of working class voters who have gone to Trump. A lot of that Trump base is not what we would call working class by any stretch of the imagination. And so, I think, our path lies elsewhere. And one final thing about that, and it's not simply which class you're appealing to or whom you're appealing to, it's also about changing the conversation. I feel like we are still very much trapped in a conversation, the terms of which are set by the right. The thing that was, the promise of Sanders and the promise of AOC and all that is to change the terms of the conversation. And I'm still hopeful that that's possible. So I'll stop there.
I just wanted to, point to one thing that you didn't mention, which was the For the People Act, because you did mention how minoritarianism is key to Republican strategy. So why aren't the Democrats taking more seriously eliminating that possibility?
Yes, thank you. I had that written down here, and I wanted to get to that. I think it's a great question because it, in some ways I find the Democrats much more of a puzzling party than I do the Republicans. Everything we're taught in Poli-Sci 101 is, like parties want to get elected, like, they want to get their people elected. And the Democrats, just don't seem to be doing that. And I don't know what the answer to that. One possible answer is they're just actually not really that interested. And they feel like, this sort of standoff, and it is a standoff that they're engaged in between the Democrats and the Republicans, whether when the Republicans are in power, they really can't legislatively do that much. And that's been clear under Trump. And the Democrats are themselves constrained, actually serves, the kind of you know, cap wing of the Democratic Party. And they do things around the edges, and that's that. So that could be, that could be the possibility. There are other possibilities. It's just not really much of a party. The most coordinated thing that they were able to do is to, the couple of days before South Carolina, get their act together and finally settle on Biden, which, what's interesting about that is they weren't able to do that throughout the fall. They toggled between, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and this one, Buttigieg for a while. They were ping-ponging everywhere, and they weren't able to anoint anybody until suddenly they got some discipline when Bernie Sanders started seeming real. And that tells you something about that party and kind of what they're able to do. But I think I feel as confused as you do, frankly, about them, and I would be less than honest if I pretended like I had a sharp answer to that question.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing about that? Why I'm confused. Both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton were real ideologues in their way who had a very clear sense, very different sense, but very clear sense of what it was that they were doing. Bill Clinton thought, we have got to move this party out of the orbit of the New Deal. That is my project, and that's what he did. And he had a whole counter narrative to do that. Barack Obama had a new narrative of how to update that, kind of make it embrace multiculturalism and marry it to neoliberalism. Bill Clinton really ran on a kind of white working class, all the stuff we think about Trump. Bill Clinton did all of that kind of stuff, right? With the crime bill and this, that, and the other. Obama, kind of moved things away from that. He really embraced the kind of technocratic, we're the party of the smart people, and people loved it and were excited by it, and we're going to kind of bring the youth in, and so he had a formula. And what's striking now is that they just do not have a formula, the Democrats. Biden's formula is like, I'm not Trump, and normalcy, and everybody knows that. Well, the first thing is true, but the second is misbegotten. So it's doubly puzzling, your question, if you think about it kind of historically, that you did have these two Democratic presidents who kind of had a formula, and I just don't think they have one now.
Which again, I do think is an opportunity for the
Yes,
left, insofar as the strength of the opposition within the Democratic Party also is like ideologically incoherent and all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, and let me just add to that, it's both an opportunity, but it's also a constraint because, the Democratic Party, in certain ways, the forces that were able to stop Sanders are, in certain ways, and I apologize to the older people on this call. I'm over 50, so I'm sort of more on your end of things. But the forces that were able to stop Sanders were kind of older voters, both white and black, and it does it is an opportunity, the fact that the kind of party itself is a little bit inchoate, and yet on one fundamental demographic level, the two parties are somewhat similar, which is that they are controlled by older people. And it's a lot like the 1920s in a lot of ways, going into the 1930s. It's a lot like the 1920s.
So we have a couple rounds already on Stack. If anyone else wants to get on Stack, really needs to ask a question, get on Stack now. Otherwise, I'm going to close it, and I'm going to go now with this round. One more question that was written in the chat, and then W. Bilderback and Timothy Lewis. So this one is the one that was written is from Maureen M. Do you think there will be longevity to the turn of some on the young left during the pandemic towards an embrace of limits, like defending economic and emancipatory vision of the left, but preoccupied with the notion that material resources are limited and time to act big may be limited in the Anthropocene, some sort of Christopher Laschy idea?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, and next is W. Bilderback.
I can't unmute my video for some reason, but I think actually, Corey, you may have answered this question, but it was about my question was about the attempts by state legislatures around the country to suppress the vote. And even here in Pennsylvania, you may be aware that the state Republicans are trying to gerrymander the court system to try and prevent a repeat of what happened in this last year and get control. How important is that? And I know you don't consider yourself a strategist, but other than the obvious answer of organizing, what are you have any suggestions for that?
And then Timothy Lewis.
Thank you again. Thank you again, Corey, for joining us. I have a hypothesis, and that I teach my students when I'm talking about sort of social history, and I'm curious what you think of it. I know your work is on conservatives, but I can't help but feel that from Edmund Burke on, there is this like group in the middle, whether you want to call it, whether it's Joe Biden, whether it's Theodore Roosevelt, like there's always like a group who's basically making this argument that, well, we need to give the socialist barbarians at the gate something so that they don't blow the system up. I'm curious if you see I'm curious whether that helps enlighten us on what Joe Biden's ideology is, or what Barack Obama's ideology is. And I guess the second thing I'm curious about is do you think one of the problems that conservatism has right now is just that is it capable of offering economic benefits to the majority of people, right? Like I feel like up through at least the 1980s, conservatism could say, hey, move out to the suburbs, keep your taxes low. We'll keep the folks from the city from moving in through busing. Do they have that ability to offer that to a majority of people? Is that why they're struggling? Sorry, I know that's a lot, but
No. I'll start with that last question. I think the answer is definitely no, and it's just kind of amazing, how much they know it in a way, and that's partially why they engage in a lot of this other stuff that they engage as. But the answer is no. But that's not really so simple, I think, for our side, because I think and we it seems so obvious, I think, to people on the left, like capitalism is broken, and the Republican Party is broken, and so this is our opportunity. But the corrosion and the success of the conservative movement goes beyond that. I mean, what the battle has always been from the right is to say that you cannot use politics as a means of transforming the social order in a better way, right? That, in other words, the kind of imagination of the left, that if you organize your workplace, that if you organize your church, that if you organize, consciousness raising groups among women, that if you do all of these things, we will gain power and we will transform women's estate, the situation of African Americans, workers, and so forth. The right really successfully attacked and destroyed that idea. And so what we're left with in an era when just the kind of the social misery that we see, it doesn't necessarily benefit the left, because there is such limited faith in the possibility of politics and government. Whether your idea of politics is social movements or government or vote or whatever it is, there's such limited idea in the possibility of using those tools to transform in a fundamental way people's personal situation. And so I think this is kind of the crisis that we're in. And it took the labor movement decades of organizing to build that kind of common sense that, like, if you organize, you can get results. And we don't have that. I mean, and it wasn't until younger people, frankly, came along with Occupy and then DSA and all these things that we have, begun to kind of regenerate that idea on the left. But it's, we're still very, early in that process. There's a question about suppressing the vote and what to do about it. I mean, one thing I will say, again, I don't know the answer to that, but what I've been most impressed by, I mean, people forget, there was a lot of fear of the effects of gerrymandering going into the 2018 midterms. Remember, I mean, there was a lot of discussion about this. And that was one of the biggest upsets since Watergate, when the Democrats won back those seats in the House. And so I guess what I would say is we should be very alert and vigilant about these efforts. But I actually take a kind of opposite, kind of more hope from it, because what I feel like what we have seen is that the counter mobilization has been, often as strong, if not stronger, to what happened in Georgia. And so, organizing doesn't always work, but it seems to be working more. It seems to be working more than it used to.
Great, and we have our last round. So James Cregan, Xander Buell, Joe Wesley, and David Diaz, you put yourself on stack. You had gone before, so if it's something short and quick, you can go ahead at the end. So James, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Corey. But you say that your work emphasizes the commonalities of a right that seems to include everyone from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump to the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. But I wonder but you yourself suggested a couple answers ago, that commonality may be falling apart, the cement of the right may not be holding. So doesn't that seem to point to a greater need to interrogate the heterogeneity of the right and the various elements that compose it, as opposed to emphasizing its commonalities?
Oh, I see. Right.
I mean, for certain people on the right, you define it as a defense of hierarchies, but to certain elements of the right, certain kinds of hierarchies may be more important than others. If you're in the ruling class, you're interested in defending primarily the economic hierarchy. There are other people may be committed to defending white supremacy. Other people, the primacy of the Christian religion. And these things sometimes can be compatible, but they can sometimes collide.
Yeah.
So there is within this, in other words, a hierarchy of hierarchies in within the minds of all of these factions. But when you're interrogating what the right is today, or what the Republican Party is today, you've got to, I think, ask the question of which elements are in command and which hierarchies are most important to them.
And next it's Xander Buell. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
No, not at all. That was perfect. Well, thank you for taking my question. Corey, I love your book. It was really, really illuminating, and I recommend it to everybody I know who's, even remotely interested in politics. And this question was already kind of touched upon a little bit earlier, but I did want to ask again about the filibuster. You mentioned obviously the Senate is an inherently anti-democratic institution, probably most notably because of the filibuster. And it really is amazing to read about all of the legislation that has been used to successfully block good legislation throughout the decades. It's really disturbing. But I hear a lot of talk, more than ever, it seems, about potentially nuking the filibuster. And even just today, Senator John Tester came out and said, hey, I think we really need to make the case to people to get rid of this thing, because it's just been used to stonewall legislation. And even I think a few weeks ago, Senator Bob Casey said the same thing, or expressed openness to nuking the filibuster. And this isn't me saying, oh, Casey and Tester, thank you, comrades, solidarity. But that seems significant. I mean, I don't think that's something we can just ignore, that these moderate Democrats are coming around to, well, look, if this is going to stand in the way of every single thing we want to do over the next year or two, then we got to do something about it. There are a number of extremely popular Democratic bills on the horizon: the Equality Act, the Voting Rights Act, the PRO Act, and whatever your your political compass is, whether you're a liberal or a leftist or an anarcho-Bidenist. I mean, those are pretty significant. I don't think that it's so impossible in my mind to imagine like Schumer or Pelosi or whoever else in Democratic leadership, like going back to their constituents saying, oh, we tried, oh well, Voting Rights Act, who cares? Just vote for more of us next time, you dirty peasants. It just seems so incredibly untenable to me that they could just let those fall by the wayside and they wouldn't spark some kind of enormous backlash. So I guess my question is, with all this debate about the filibuster, it seems like the consensus is growing day by day that they have to do something about it. If they nuked the filibuster and passed these very popular reforms, do you think that that would finally kind of kick open that door to a potential realignment that we haven't seen in potentially decades?
I do think anarcho-Bidenist may describe my political ideology. If I finally found the term. And I'll go to Joe Wesley as the last on the staff.
I think I'll defer because I think my question was substantively asked and answered previously.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Corey.
So the first question was a great question, and that basically, given that there is a kind of weakening of the right where each party, is kind of in contestation, doesn't it make the differences more important than traditionally they were? Which is, I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but I see the power of that question. And I think that's right. And in fact, it actually explains some of the, I think, certain kind of confusion that I have right now about the right, which is that the right was once disciplined in order to kind of figure out a way, not only just to kind of satisfy each of those constituencies, it had a coherent ideology that connected them all. And this is, the so-called fusion strategy. And if you look at the underlying philosophy that brought that together in the 60s, you could see like, oh, it really makes sense for these very statist cold warriors to get together with these kind of libertarianish economic conservatives and, who are sort of modernist in their morals with these very, cultural conservatives. It all worked. And it's increasingly, not working. And so then you said the question, whose hierarchy is the who's at the top of the hierarchy in terms of their hierarchies, and my best answer to you is like I just generally don't know right now, because it's not as if the economic conservatives got everything that they wanted. Far from it. The Koch people were very dissatisfied with the Trump regime. The heritage people, if you look at what the agenda was, were pretty, they got the tax cuts and they got the courts, but a lot of things they didn't. And so, they're not satisfied. Obviously, the national security conservatives were very leery of a lot of what was going on under Trump. And the social conservatives did get the court appointments and, maybe we're happy with that. But meanwhile, a lot of their kind of culture war battles, they've been losing, on gay rights, and so forth. So, I don't, so that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I don't know. And it's precisely because there is no discipline on the right today that it's very hard to tell, who's winning within those fissures and battles. On the filibuster, so yeah, I totally agree. I hope it didn't sound as if I were diminishing the significance of getting rid of the filibuster. I think it's absolutely significant. And particularly, frankly, on the question of voting rights, I think is really fundamental. And, you said, that could precipitate maybe that realignment that we're talking about. It could also be the reason why the Democrats in the end don't get rid of the filibuster, because, realignments in politics aren't just about going after the opposition party. They force a fundamental confrontation within the party that's doing the realigning. That's what, the whole battle about Reaganism was, are we going to be the party of Nelson Rockefeller and Jacob Javits, or are we going to be the party of Barry Goldwater and Paul Laxalt and, people out here in the Southwest? So, realignments, pose problems for both parties. I will just say one thing though about getting rid of the filibuster. Remember, because you said, it's part of the most anti-democratic part of the Senate. But the truth is the Senate itself is such an extraordinarily undemocratic party. Right now, with a 50-50 split that we have in the Senate, you have the Democrats representing 56% of the population and the Republicans representing 44%. Let's say you did get rid of the filibuster, right? you still have that extraordinarily undemocratic institution where Joe Manchin becomes the decider, you know? Right now it's people, you know, in the opposite way that are the deciders with the filibuster. So, you know, where that leaves us, I'm not quite sure, but I absolutely think this is a critical step and may well happen. I can't remember what the last question was. Yikes, I didn't.
I think that was it.
Oh,
Do
was that it?
you have any concluding thoughts you just want to say, Corey?
No, except, you know, one, thank you, and two, like I want to stress something I sort of hinted at throughout here, which is, and this is not pandering. In my past, I've done some political organizing, and I know how hard that work is, and how important it is, and how sometimes unrewarding it can be. And I just, you know, I do think what you guys do in DSA, and I shouldn't say, I would say we, except I feel like I don't do the work, so I can't really say we, but I certainly identify. But I don't want it to be a false, you know, like I'm sitting there in the trenches, because I'm not. But it's just awesome, you know, and every time, you know, I see, you know, a little blip of movement here in New York City or somewhere else in Pennsylvania or in Virginia, I'm just, you know, it does convince me like this will happen, however long it takes. So just hats off to all you guys.
Thank you. Great note to end on. We'll just make a couple of announcements. I think some of our political educators have some announcements. So if someone from Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, great discussion, everybody. Great questions. Corey, thank you so much. I know it was enlightening for a lot of us. I'm gonna say real quick about Lower Manhattan, and then also about Central Brooklyn, because they couldn't send their representative tonight. Lower Manhattan has 3 things happening within the next week. Our Capital Reading Group, we're halfway through Capital. That is happening next Tuesday. There's a link for that. We have a Catalyst reading group, the Catalyst Journal published by Jacobin, that just started. That is having its second session. The date is March 4th. So that's coming up. And get back into Zoom. Here's a link for that. That's on Chile's Democratic Revolution, a piece written by Rene Rojas, Allende, Democratic Socialism in Chile, all of those things. And then our general meeting, Lower Manhattan's general meeting, Lower Manhattan Polyed's general meeting is next Sunday. And if you would like to attend that, please email that email address, and we'll put you on the list for that. And then really quick, Central Brooklyn has a night school going on right now, and their next session is on the Green New Deal, and that is going to be 2 Thursdays from now, so March 11th. And there is a link for that. So that's it for me.
I'm
North
gonna hand
Brooklyn.
it to Mia from North Brooklyn.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. This is Mia with North Brooklyn. Before you guys drop off, I want to let you guys know about perhaps the most exciting night school program happening. I am biased, but we also have a great night school going in North Brooklyn. We are in the middle of our winter semester, but we encourage everyone to jump right in. Each session is very kind of standalone, so you can jump in whenever. Our next one is not this upcoming Monday, but the Monday after. It's every other Monday at 7 p.m. So on March 8th is the next one, and it is on immigration. It's going to be really great with John Washington as our guest speaker. So I'm just dropping the Action Network link for that for you guys to RSVP. It should be really, really great. I'm also going to drop the Facebook event for those of you who remember things through Facebook events like me. So we really hope you can make it. Thank you.
And the last thing I'll just say before we part ways is, you know, we have 1 more month before the budget is passed in Albany. It is not too late to get involved in the Tax the Rich campaign. We need phone banking. We need people to be meeting with their legislators. We need people to be doing door hangers. We really need all hands on deck. So I'm going to just put the link. Please, please, please get involved. We have work to do. We have $50 billion of rich people's money to win to change the state and make it a working class paradise. Let's do it. So again, thank you so much, Corey. And thanks to everybody for coming, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all.
Solidarity.